Hello, everybody. Welcome to an online event of Tokyo College. I am Haneda Masashi, Director of Tokyo College, and today's moderator. I'm really happy to introduce you Professor Andrew Gordon of Harvard University once again. And of course, he has already made two talks throughout our website. And Professor Gordon is a professor of history, especially history of labor, and he's interested in the history of industrial heritage. He has been a very good of Tokyo College, very good friend of Tokyo College since its establishment in 2019. He gave his first lecture already in July 2019 with the title Dark Tourism in Japan, Global, National, and Local Perspective. And the second lecture was given a year later in July 2020 with the title Modern Memories, the Public History of Industrial Heritage in Japan. He gave this talk at the end of his 6-month stay at Tokyo College, which corresponded exactly with the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And 3 years after that, he gave back to Tokyo in January of this year and stayed with us for more than 4 months. So we have the privilege of listening to Professor Gordon's talk for the 3rd time today. And the title of this talk is, he slightly changed his title, and the exact title today is The Lining Landscape of Modern Memories, Industrial Heritage Sites, Old and New. Like this, he keeps having interest in the modern industrial heritage in Japan. Let's listen to his research achievements over last 3 years. And for today's lecture, I requested Professor OKAHASHI Junko to make comments. And she's a professor at the University of the Sacred Heart, and she's an expert of cultural heritage studies and international cultural cooperation. She worked as a program specialist at the culture sector of UNESCO headquarters in Paris from 2022 to 2011, nearly 10 years. And she got a PhD at the University of Tokyo, and she taught at Tsukuba University before moving to the current position at the University of the Sacred Heart. And I believe that she is an ideal discussant for today's Professor Gordon's lecture. So let's start today's lecture. Professor Gordon, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Professor Haneda. Let me share the screen first of all. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Haneda, for your kind introduction for me and for this talk, and also thanks in advance to Professor OKAHASHI for your comments later. And thanks to you in the audience for joining. I also want to give a particular thanks to my collaborator or partner in crime on this project, Professor Ide Akira of Kanazawa University, who has accompanied me on numerous field visits and helped a lot. This is a work in progress. As Professor Haneda mentioned, I've spoken on it before, and I will probably speak on it again. And so I need your feedback, whether during the Q&A or by email later. This project was sparked by a controversy and a surprising realization. The controversy came in 2015 when the sites of Japan's Meiji-era Industrial Revolution were nominated by the Japanese government to UNESCO for inscription as World Heritage Sites, which in fact happened after some controversy. These are located mostly in Kyushu. There's a photograph here of a place I visited, the Mitsui Miike mine. This is from a postcard advertising the Kita Kyushu sites. These are coal mines, iron furnaces, and steel mills and shipyards. The controversy stemmed from objections from the South Korean government and also the PRC government to the lack of any acknowledgement of wartime history, especially the use of drafted and forced labor in these sites. The surprise was, and the sudden realization was, that I had studied these places. I had written about them in my first book, which you see the cover of. At the time, they were still living work sites. Now they were shut down, and they had become part of Japan's industrial heritage. And I hadn't really noticed this. I was a little disappointed in myself that I hadn't noticed this. I was also, I suppose, even more disappointed at the narrowness of the Japanese government's presentation of these sites and their importance, which focused almost 100% on technology. The Japanese petition to UNESCO put forward the claim that these industrial locations were proof that Japan was the first non-Western nation to industrialize through a self-determined strategy, which I believe is true. But the claim to the importance of this rested nearly 100% on mastery and adaptation of Western technology. I am sympathetic to the calls for a fuller presentation beyond just technology of the history of forced wartime labor, but I am also frustrated at the narrowness of this criticism when it only focuses on wartime labor. That omission is lamentable, but it's not the only thing missing from the Japanese government's presentation. What's also missing is the lack of anything in what the Japanese government puts forward to UNESCO or says on site about a different kind of forced labor, the use of Japanese prison labor. This is hardly a secret. In the Meiji period, in 1916, Taisho 5, the Japanese, the Mitsui company itself put up this grand monument to its several decades of history from the 1870s and 80s. And on the back of this company-built monument is an inscription. It may be possible for some of you to read it in Japanese, I'm not sure, that talks about the use of prison labor. There was nothing in the petition to UNESCO about Japanese prison labor. There was nothing about the harsh labor conditions for all the workers, prisoners or not. Nothing about, virtually nothing about accidents, nothing about disease afflicting the miners, whether lung disease or cholera, and nothing about the key role that these industries played in the Meiji period itself, enabling Japan to secure an empire with colonial possessions in Taiwan and Korea. So I decided I wanted to revisit these sites that I had looked at previously and ask this question: what possibilities are there, if any, to realize and tell a fuller and richer history? And I decided it was important to look not only at the UNESCO-inscribed locations, but also at some of the many other sites of industrial heritage in Japan. So today I want to make three main points about, in general, industrial heritage in Japan. First, the marking and presentation of heritage is a fluid process. This point goes beyond industrial heritage. Sites of heritage, of course, cannot be moved physically, but even if the locations are fixed, the meanings of these places are not fixed. They are fluid and they are contested. Second, the process of defining and contesting industrial heritage has been and remains varied and lively in Japan. It is far more lively than the officially authorized heritage presentations to UNESCO. Third, that said, the contested or divergent stories are not being related on a level field. Power, prestige, money matters in enabling some stories to gain ascendance over others. So today, to develop this point, I will focus on two sites of industrial heritage that were not part of the Meiji era industrial heritage sites nominated to UNESCO, and I doubt either of them will ever be nominated. The older one is the Ashio copper mine and refinery, with a rich history and a long history of public recognition dating back to the late 19th century. And here is a photograph taken of the mining complex in 1895. The second is well known to you, Fukushima #1, or Fukushima Dai-ichi nuclear power plant, Japan's newest industrial heritage site, often given the nickname 1F, which I'll use today. These two places, I choose them because both are indeed fluid, changing and contested sites of industrial heritage. And in considering them together, we see a great example of the adage attributed to Mark Twain, although there's in fact no clear evidence that he is the one who wrote or said this, but it's still a great adage. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Today, I want to juxtapose the rhyming echoes and also some differences between Ashio and Fukushima. I hope to amplify the 3 points I have posed above: fluidity of heritage, contested meaning of heritage, and the imbalance in telling stories. And I'll end with some brief reflection, comparative reflection on these two sites and those inscribed with UNESCO. So I divide the rhyme into 4 stanzas. Stanza 1 is one of celebration. Both of these places in their own time were initially celebrated. Ashio was Japan's most important copper mine and refinery of the Meiji era and 20th century, first half of the 20th century. As in this map, it sprawled across the hillsides near the headwaters of the Watarase River. And in the red circle is where the mine was located. The mine's history dates from the Tokugawa era. The copper was used to mint coins and construct shrines and temples, most famously the Nikko shrine. At the time, Nikko was a one-day hike from Ashio across the mountains. But the mine closed in the late Tokugawa era because copper deposits that were reachable by the technology of that time were exhausted. Then, after the Meiji Restoration in 1877, this man, Furukawa Ichibei, took over the mine and adjacent refinery. He discovered rich deposits. He contracted with the German firm Siemens to bring state-of-the-art technology to the mine. By the turn of the 20th century, Ashio accounted for 40% of Japan's copper output. It was the largest copper mine in Asia. It was one of the largest in the world. It employed about 10,000 workers at the mine and refinery at this time. Furukawa was really proud of this enterprise, and he welcomed visitors to observe the refinery operations. By the early 20th century, nearby Nikko had become one of Japan's top tourist destinations. And also, I was surprised to learn that the Nikko-Ashio route had become a staple of the new practice of school field trips in Japan. And so one neat example of a field trip visit comes from Akutagawa Ryunosuke, among Japan's most renowned writers. In 1911, in one of his earliest essays, he described a visit to Ashio as a high school student in 1909. And this is a very small excerpt from the story. He wrote, "Before the path from Chuzenji to Ashio reached the Furukawa Bridge was a row of dilapidated shacks. The workers in the refinery appeared blackened. In front of the red fire of the furnace, the thunder of machinery, shouts of workers, a chaos of sounds in the dimly lit factory." This lyrical prose was unusual, but it was a typical experience at the time. Fukushima 1F was also, from the time of its construction in the late 1960s to the day it suddenly ceased to produce electricity in 2011, a focus of celebration by TEPCO and the local community and visitors. It was also built with foreign technology, in this case American, GE, not German. There were some opponents and doubters about this nuclear power facility and in general nuclear power all along in Japan, but they were drowned out by a chorus of proud celebration. Most famous as a material symbol of this pride was the signboard. It's a little bit reminiscent of a Shinto Torii shrine that runs here across in this photograph. It's no longer standing there. So this photograph shows it at the entrance to the town of Futaba, where the plant was located. And as Akutagawa had done a century before the 311 meltdown, 100 years exactly before, actually, in 1911. From the 1970s to 2011, Japanese school children in the local area around the plant made frequent visits to the plant. With less literary skill, I believe, but with earnest intent, they wrote compositions of thanks and praise. And this is one of them exhibited at the prefectural archive to the disaster that I'll talk about in a little bit. And it's written by a 6th grader at the Hirono Elementary School right near the plant. So stanza 1 is the stanza of celebration of industry and its achievements. Stanza 2 in this rhyming history is a sad song of environmental damage. The Ashio copper mine, and especially the refinery, are known to posterity and to many of you, I'm sure, for the worst pollution disaster of Japan's early industrial era. The chemical villains of this story are 2, sulfurous acid gas emitted from the refinery smokestacks, and toxic wastewater. These flowed into the Watarase River, which ran south from the plant, and you can see the river downstream basin in the lower part of this map. The victims of Ashio's pollution lived in 2 widely separated areas. Just north of the mine and refinery was Matsuki village. You see it here. It was home to about 170 people at the time the mine and refinery began operating. By 1884, just 7 years after that operation began, the trees in the vicinity of the village had begun to die. Over the next decade, sulfurous gas emissions and also aggressive logging of the hillside by the company to help build the mine had destroyed the woodlands and vegetation that provided the foundation for village life. And these 2 photographs, one from the Tanaka Shozo Memorial Museum and another shown to me by the guide who showed me around here in 2020, show you the desiccated, devastated hillsides due to the pollution. But the more numerous and famous victims of Ashio's pollution lived about 70 to 80 kilometers downstream in the lower Watarase River basin region. In 1885, already, just 8 years after the refinery began operations, people downstream found the fish were dying in the river. Even before Furukawa developed the mine, actually, that lower Watarase River Valley region, it's also shown in yellow on the map in the middle, was prone to flooding by relatively pure water or mud. And that too would destroy crops. But the burgeoning operations of the mine, of course, made the problem worse in 2 ways. One, the bald hillsides upstream meant that heavy rains washed more and more soil into the river, carried it downstream. That silt raised the riverbed. It made flooding more common. Also, it wasn't just flooding water and mud, but toxic mine waste, chromium, arsenic, and such, that was coming down the river and flooding and poisoning the farmland. By 1903, in one estimate, the area, and it's shown in yellow on the middle map here, the area of about 100 square miles of farmland had been either destroyed or reduced in its productive capacity by the poisoned floodwaters. And you see a photograph of some of this desiccated field, desiccated farm produce on the right-hand side. The damaged environment story at Fukushima is, I'm sure, much more familiar to all of you. As you know, it was radiation that was the villain. It was released into the atmosphere by the meltdown and then spread in an uneven plume that descended to the ground and rendered both farming and living in the area impossible. And these maps show radiation levels measured in the soil, not in the air, but in the soil along the Fukushima coast. And the 2 left-hand maps show the radiated soil levels in immediate aftermath and a decade later. And the 3 on the right are, of course, projections of the expected levels of radiation. So stanza 2 is this rhyme of environmental devastation. Stanza 3 is a rhyme of protests, including lawsuits aimed at the corporations and the state, and also evacuation and loss of community. At Ashio, the Matsuki villagers upstream protested directly to Furukawa, demanding compensation and funds to relocate elsewhere. And the 2 parties, Furukawa Mining and the villagers, reached agreement in December of 1901 that the Furukawa company would purchase the land in the village and the villagers would be able to relocate. By 1902, just a year later, all but 1 household had departed, leaving behind the brown and barren landscape I showed you in the previous photo. The downstream story was more dramatic and affected more people, and it's better known. In 1890, 89 villages lost all their crops to poisoned floodwaters. The particularly aggrieved Yanaka Village Assembly sued Furukawa for damages and demanded the relocation of the refinery. Furukawa did not move the refinery or mine, of course, but did offer some payment for damages. But the protests continued, and their focus shifted from the axis of contention shifted from villagers versus the company to subjects versus the state. And in 1891, the second year of the convening of the Japanese Diet that opened in 1890, the representative from the Ashio region, a man named Tanaka Shozo, made his first of many speeches demanding that the mine stop operations. And thanks to photos, thanks to protests by the farmers, and you saw images of some of those protests in the previous slide, thanks to protests by the farmers led by Tanaka, upstream, the government ordered Furukawa to build filtration basins for refinery wastewater and install scrubbers on the smokestacks. And downstream, in the following few years, a somewhat effective remediation was put in place, although at a heavy cost to the downstream farmers. This took the form of a state engineering project. Its name is on the slide, the Watarase Containment Basin, a flood control basin that was put in place by the Japanese government in 1906. The basin, in fact, proved relatively successful in containing future floods, not completely, but relatively successful. But it had a cost. It was going to inundate most of Yanaka village in particular. The villagers and Tanaka opposed the plan. Some refused to sell their lands. And these photos are of some of the farming families that held out to the very end, refusing to sell and refusing to move. But the government forced the issue and went ahead, destroyed the homes, forced the people to leave. And by the end of 1906, this Watarase containment basin was completed. Over the following years, Tochigi Prefecture moved the Yanaka village farmers and others whose lands were too poisoned to productive elsewhere. They paid for their relocation and resettlement costs. In the most extreme example of a move, or in the most extreme move in 1911, 60 households were sent from Tochigi Prefecture, Watarase River area to the very northern reaches of Hokkaido. You see the blue marker. That's the town of Saroma, next to Saroma Lake, facing the Sea of Okhotsk. And these farmers renamed their village Tochigi Village, marking where they had come from. And this is a map that is in a display today in Saroma Village Citizens Civic Center. And you see in the upper right, you can see the edge of the sea, and then Saroma Lake, and then the Saroma Village, and the place marked in yellow is the Tochigi district now. In the vicinity of Fukushima, the story of evacuation, protest, and lost community is better known, I'm sure, to all of you. The government ordered citizens living in the most heavily radiated towns to evacuate with, in some cases, just a day or two's notice. They were compensated by TEPCO, but lawsuits have continued from some, demanding further compensation. And this is a photograph of one group of protesters seeking further compensation. These suits are still ongoing. As at Ashio, the division between those who agreed to leave and those who wanted to stay, or those who accepted compensation and needed or didn't get it or wanted more, have divided the communities intensely. Also, in Fukushima, the number of what are called disaster-related deaths, stemming not from the tsunami or radiation or the earthquake, but from the stress of evacuation, has been a major problem. And this number, it's the On the right, you see a panel from the nuclear power accident museum in Fukushima, in Futaba. You can see that as the number increases, the panel is updated, and as of the end of March 2022, so a little over a year ago, 2,336 people's deaths have been attributed to the stress of evacuation. So stanza 3, protest, evacuation, lost community. The fourth and final stanza in this rhyming history is a somewhat more upbeat one of rebuilding and also rebranding. In Ashio, upstream, in the vicinity of what had been the Matsuki village, it's a story of regreening of the land. And both nonprofit organizations and prefectural and national governments have been assiduously reforesting the hillsides. This signboard I took a photo of it. It's standing in the vicinity of the Matsuki village, and it's put up by a nonprofit organization to return green to the mountains. And you can see in the upper left a 2005 photo of still pretty much bald mountains, and then on the upper right a 2015 photo of the fruits of their labors. And downstream, the Watarase containment basin, which had been put up to prevent flooding, has turned into a really beautiful place that's been designated under the terms of the International Ramsar Treaty, important wildlife and vegetation habitat. And it really is a lovely place to visit, as I learned when I went there earlier this spring. So Ashio's rebranding has been a green place. The rebuilding and rebranding of 1F has focused differently on new technologies, in part new and better technology than nuclear power technology. Solar panels are everywhere. Also, the government is investing in hydrogen cars in the region and a hydrogen manufacturing power plant. In the right-hand picture, I'm standing in front of a massive hydrogen manufacturing plant that's right nearby where the nuclear power plant is. And on the left is a hydrogen filling station for hydrogen cars. And beyond just energy, the very ambitious Fukushima Innovation Coast Framework, funded by the national government through the prefecture into the area, seeks to make Fukushima coastal region a place at the cutting edge of new technologies of other sorts as well, not only environmental technologies, but robots, drones, medicine, aerospace. The screenshot from the website of this Fukushima Innovation Coast Framework shows a massive robot testing field that's being put in place there. And also, although I don't have time to discuss it today, promotion of tourism is part of the rebuilding strategy in this area. So, in these four ways: initial celebration, environmental damage, protest, evacuation, and loss, and rebuilding and rebranding, we have a rhyming history of two places separated by over a century. And what we are left with at present is a very rich, fluid, evolving, and in some ways contested memory landscape in both places. And I want to spend the rest of the talk today giving you a tour of this current memory landscape, focusing on corporate public history, state commemorations, and municipal and civil society initiatives. So first, the corporate story, which in Ashio, as in all aspects of Ashio, has an upstream and a downstream aspect. Upstream, the Ashio Furukawa company mainly celebrates its heritage. It was interesting to me that although the mine closed in 1974, the refinery closed in 1989, it wasn't until 16 years later, in 2005, that this Ashio History Hall opened. And here you see the view from the outside. I was asked not to share the photos of the inside of the exhibit. The focus on the inside is on company achievements. There's also some on the history of the labor force, but virtually nothing on the pollution issue. Elsewhere in the town of Ashio, upstream, there's a place now open to visitors, this Grand Fukushima Kakemisu Club, it was called. It was the VIP guest house back in the day, and now visitors can see the grand life of the managers and supervisors and visitors. The Fukushima disaster, and here I see a contrast, has produced two noteworthy corporate memory sites, a contrast that is with Furukawa and Ashio. In Fukushima itself, a decommissioning center has been created, an information center, on the site of what had been a PR center for the #2 Fukushima reactor, which was built, of course, after #1 and in the town of Tomioka, very nearby the Fukushima #1 plant, and efforts were made to tell the town and the people in the area what a great thing this was going to be. That information center has been repurposed as a decommissioning information center. The exhibit inside is quite full of contrite rhetoric that actually contrasts to the Furukawa company sites. Although I was disappointed that it does not use the word meltdown. It speaks in its exhibit of the fact that the reactor core melted through the containment vessel, but it evasively avoids the word meltdown. It's also an ironic and I guess iconic facade in that these three different housing facades on the decommissioning center, which had been the PR center, are replicas of the homes of Madame Curie, Thomas Edison, and Albert Einstein. I think in that order. The second important center put up by TEPCO is closer to where we are today. It's in Kawasaki. It's called the TEPCO 311 Center to Convey Facts and Lessons of the Fukushima Nuclear Power Accident. It's adjacent to an a history of electricity museum that's now more or less closed. I was fortunate to be able to visit this place, although it's mostly for the use of TEPCO employees and not at the moment open to the public. I was impressed. I felt it does speak very straightforwardly on the problems that led to the disaster, telling the story to its current employees. A story of overconfidence, of excessive belief in a safety myth, as this photo I took from one of the panels, talks about the need to overcome the safety myth and build a true culture of safety in the company. In addition, I don't have photos of this. I was asked not to take photos from inside the Fukushima plant itself. A sign of the long time span over which the public history and memory landscape of Fukushima Dai-ichi will be created is the fact that there's consideration of leaving several large ruined structures in place as monuments for the future. And this is the decision of what will be done with the plant after decommissioning and what will be left on site in this way as monuments or eco is one being taken by the company, I was told by members of the company, in discussion with the local community. So that's the corporate telling of the story, a bit different between the two places. The state story in both places at the national and prefectural levels generally seeks to avoid confronting responsibility in both cases. The state would rather focus on recovery and the future. Though again, there is more flexibility and ongoing change in the Fukushima case. The Watarase containment basin that I showed you earlier is now managed by the government, by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. What's interesting and to me frustrating is that in the signage, in this really beautiful place, there is virtually no indication that there is this important Yanaka village historical site. It's about 100 meters behind this signboard, but there's almost no indication on this signboard that this is a place that exists or deserves to be visited. Some local figures supporting and maintaining the historical site of the village have been pressing the government to change the signage, so far to no avail. In Fukushima, the state memory landscape mainly is rests now in a single place, the Nuclear Power Disaster Memorial Museum in Futaba, which is the town where, one of the two towns where the power plant is located. It opened recently in the summer of 2020. It welcomed 30,000 visitors in just the first 4 months, despite the pandemic. The director at the outset wanted this museum to take a future orientation. When it opened, he told people, including the Asahi reporter whose article I cite here, that, quote, rather than the question of the responsibility for the disaster, we will focus on what the people of the prefecture have done in moving toward recovery and what path the local government has taken over the past 9 years. This stance, future-oriented stance, was criticized not only in the national media, but locally, and it led to change. And this is really notable. Local pushback has forced changes in how the story is being told, even in just the past 3 years. For instance, this new panel was added both in Japanese as well as in English. I would actually translate the Japanese panel a little more harshly into English than what you see here. I think a literal translation would be the collapse of the safety myth, a human disaster of lazy countermeasures. So this is a very forthright statement of criticism of the company and government. And this panel was added after the protests at the exhibit, or the complaints about the exhibit, and other changes have been made. The exhibit now mentions, as I showed earlier, disaster-related deaths stemming from the deteriorated mental or physical health of evacuees. A panel has also been added on the disastrous evacuation of patients, many of whom died in the evacuation from the Futaba hospital right near the plant. Another panel mentions the work of citizen scientists who monitor the radiation levels because they don't trust the government. And also, the question of what to do with the sign has been controversial, and a replica of the now ironic, once iconic sign about the bright future of nuclear power has been built. This is the replica. At the moment, it's sitting on the ground in the back, open to the public, but in the back of the museum. And there's some question about whether it will be put on poles and erected. But the point here is that at present, especially in Fukushima, we are in the midst of an ongoing and dynamic interaction of local community, national media, and state storytelling. And I find this quite notable. So to wrap up, I want to turn to a number of municipal and civil society stories being told at present in both Ashio and then Fukushima. So Ashio, again, there's an upstream and a downstream version. Upstream in the vicinity in Ashio town, we do find 2 memorial monuments to wartime forced laborers who died working in the mine or refinery, but I think mostly the mine. On the left and in the center is a fairly modest monument or memorial site to Korean forced laborers. The guide who took me here, it's a bit hard to find, but not impossible by any means, was not sure exactly when this was put up. Behind, it's a site for prayer for people to visit and pray for the repose of the souls of those who died. It's not a grave site. There are sticks in the back that are typically used in Japanese memorial ceremonies. The oldest one that's still there is from 2003, but I'm quite sure this is older than that. And on the right, a much grander monument put up to the, in fact, more numerous Chinese workers who died working at Ashio during the war, that was put up as long ago as 1973. So there's that local marking of the history in Ashio itself. There's also numerous signboards put up, plaques with photos on them all around the town of Ashio by the Board of Education of the town. And here are just 2 of many. The one on the left is a location where a famous 4-day riot of Ashio mine workers took place in 1907. The one on the right is the Furukawa Bridge that was a notable architectural achievement at the time. It's the bridge that Akutagawa crossed and mentioned in his story when he hiked from Nikko to Ashio. Downstream, there's a really energetic memorial landscape that has its origins well back before the Second World War. It began basically with Tanaka Shozo's death in 1913. In his last years, Tanaka had joined local farmers who remained in the lower Watarase Valley to found what they called the Konaka Farm Education Club. Tanaka is the district in the town where Tanaka was born, and this is one of the two buildings of his birthplace. Upon Tanaka's death, he donated his birthplace, the two buildings in the garden in between, to the club. The club's mission was to improve farming techniques and to protect the environment, and it meets to this day periodically, and this is open to the public, and there's an exhibit inside that I visited. You see one photo on the right-hand side of a group of men in the club. All residents of Konaka district are automatically enrolled in the club. This was a gathering in the 1980s. Already in 1924, the governor of Tochigi Prefecture designated this place as a historical site to be protected. Another important site with a long history commemorating Tanaka's activities is the Unryuji Temple. This is where Tanaka would gather. It's not in the town he was born, but in the adjacent town of Tatebayashi, or city of Tatebayashi. The Unryuji Temple was the place he gathered with his fellow farmer protesters when they set off on marches to Tokyo and such. In the left photo, we see a huge grave for Tanaka, which was erected on the 20th anniversary of his death in 1933. The plaque in the middle, which explains this history, was put up in 1973, which was both 60 years after his death and also in the 70s, a time of new interest in Japan in environmental issues and protests. And also on the grounds of the temple, on the right-hand photo, is what's called the Salvation Hall. It's a place where people still gather once a year around the autumn anniversary of Tanaka's death to honor his memory. So these two sites were already publicly recognized in the 1920s and 30s. Today, they're joined by a number of new sites. Two of them are very nearby, this Unryuji Temple in the city of Tatebayashi. One is the Tanaka Shozo Memorial Hall, and you see a photo I took when I visited the spring of the outside and also of the inside. It's opened only in 2006, so less than 20 years ago. It has a richly informative, albeit low-tech, exhibit. The hall also sponsors walks in the region, in the area on some weekends. And on the grounds of this memorial hall is, I'm quite interested in this, a monument donated by a group from Niigata Prefecture seeking redress for the Minamata disease that also afflicted Niigata Prefecture in the 1950s and after. And so it's a sign, the putting up of this monument, of a national network of pollution-related sites of memory. Also close by Unryuji is this impressive monument to the location where Tanaka Shozo passed away. And it was put up as recently as 2017, just 6 years ago. And on the back is a list of all the sponsoring organizations. And on the right-hand side are organizations, on the left are individual names. So a very impressive number of individuals and organizations, including some companies and nonprofits, put this monument up just 6 years ago. In the neighboring town of Sano, where Tanaka's birthplace was, the Konaka Club, is the Sano Municipal Historical Museum, which is dominated in the main hall by this huge statue of Tanaka standing over a relief map of the landscape. And in the adjacent room is a photograph of a visit quite recently in 2014 of the now retired Heisei Emperor and Empress to this museum. They also visited the Watarase containment basin, which is not too far away from here, and they went also upstream and visited the Matsuki village area. So an impressive sign of the imperial interest. So in a sense, that's an aspect of the state story as well as the local story. The final downstream location of note, the Watarase containment basin, I show it to you here, contains the remnants of the former Yanaka village. As I said, you need to know about this place to really find it. The signage isn't great, but once you get to it, you see gravestones. I don't have that photo here. You also see markings where farmers' houses stood. About 3/4 of the village was inundated, and so the village was abandoned, but some portions remain on dry ground. There's a temple bell, to the only thing that remains of the Buddhist temple, and there's a box where your visitor can leave comments or take away the latest copy of the newsletter by the Society to Protect the Remains of Yanaka Village, the organization that maintains this site. But also, not only downstream in Ashio, in the Watarase River or in Ashio town, but also in the Tochigi district of far-off Saroma town in Hokkaido, one finds monuments to the difficult lives and survival of the migrants who came here in 1911. And there are monuments marking the 30th, 50th, and centennial anniversary of their removal to this spot. And the centennial anniversary, by an ironic coincidence, happened in 2011, the year of the Fukushima disaster, and the 1961 50th anniversary monument has, you can't read it here, but it has a very detailed description of the travails of the migrants. And there's also a standing exhibit in the Saroma Citizen Center documenting with artwork and other documents the story of the migrants. Turning now finally to Fukushima, and more briefly, because these places are still being created, and also I haven't been able to visit them all yet. Moving from south to north along the coast in the city of Iwaki, or in the hot springs area of Iwaki, an inn, the Iwaki Furutaki Onsen, on its 9th floor, the owner has turned over the banquet hall of the inn to this nuclear energy disaster investigation hall. As I said, I shouldn't comment in detail because I haven't been there yet, but on the website, it has this description in Japanese below. Now, I want to bring your attention especially to this part, the second part of my English translation. We have taken hints from places such as the Minamata Disease History Investigation Hall, which all are precious facilities seeking to learn in a way that transcends the divide of agree and disagree. And so again, bringing in Minamata, not only in connection to Ashio, but in connection to Fukushima. A little bit further north in the town of Naruha, getting closer to the plant, is a Buddhist temple, Hokyoji, which the late priest Hayakawa, working together with a nuclear scientist, Anzai Ikudo, who, like Hayakawa, has been objecting to nuclear power for decades. The two of them opened up what they call a hall of message. It's in a building adjacent to this monument with a very harshly critical presentation condemning nuclear power, condemning TEPCO, condemning nuclear weapons. Also, further to the north, just nearby the site of the decommissioning center in the town of Tomioka, is the Tomioka Municipal Archive Museum. Again, I haven't yet been able to visit, so I can't really comment in detail. People have told me it's a really fine exhibit, and its stated goal on the website is to place the compound disaster in the context of the region's history. And then finally, a place that's being planned, it's not yet opened yet, in the town of Odaka, just to the north of the Fukushima Dai-ichi plant. There's a church in Odaka town and a church yochien or kindergarten in the town. The yochien shut down after the disaster because all the children had to leave. The church has reopened, services have begun again, and now the church congregation has plans to turn the kindergarten, which is still empty and won't reopen, into an exhibit hall. Among other things, this exhibit hall will tell the story of the life of the town and its residents, both before and after the disaster. So to wrap up, I see two ongoing and evolving memory landscapes, one in Ashio, broadly defined, one in Fukushima. These stories are fluid. Their memory landscape is to some extent contested. They're evolving. There's also an incipient recognition of connection between the two separate stories I've told you today. And we find it, for instance, in a headline in the Hokkaido Shimbun, in an article about a decade ago, when in Saroma town, there was an exhibit telling the story of the evacuees from the Watarase River region to Hokkaido, Saroma town. And the headline was "The Overlap with the Fukushima Evacuees." So this connection is recognized in other forums as well. This is just one example. The curating of the public history of Fukushima is certainly going to go on for decades. The decommissioning could last into the 2040s. But even in Ashio, both upstream and downstream, and even in Hokkaido, I'm struck that new sites of memory are being put up in the 21st century. Yes, state and corporate power can try to tilt the story, but there's the possibility for pushback, as in the case of the Fukushima Museum, the Futaba-based Fukushima Prefectural Museum, and the hegemony of what you could call an authorized heritage discourse over the government is not certain. So finally, how does this compare or connect to the Meiji Industrial Revolution heritage sites that I started with? The existence of alternative stories actually being told is also found in the vicinity of the World Heritage Sites in Kyushu, although not, I believe, as robustly as in either Ashio or in Fukushima. But in the case of the Meiji Industrial Revolution World Heritage Sites, I think what happens is this, and I'm interested in Professor OKAHASHI's thoughts. Once the focus is brought to a global audience, with UNESCO being brought in, it becomes almost inevitable that there's greater pressure or a felt need, especially by the government, but not only, also by many local actors, to tell the world a sanitized story. And this stems, I think, from a desire to protect what I think is a misplaced sense of local or national pride. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. That should not be ride, that should be pride. A misplaced sense of local or national pride. And with that, let me conclude and turn things over to Professor OKAHASHI.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Gordon, for your excellent lecture based on your well-prepared but very difficult field research. And this talk is closely related with the two previous lectures done by Professor Gordon. These two lectures are have been uploaded at our YouTube channel, Tokyo College's YouTube channel. So you can find two previous lectures easily there. And just after listening these two lectures, you'll be much more interested in today's lecture and the meaning of today's lecture. Well, before asking Professor OKAHASHI to start her comments, just note to the audience, you can, as usual, you can use you can send us your comments or questions by using the button Q&A just below the screen of your just below of your screen. And so far as the time is allowed, I can pick some of these questions and ask to Professor Gordon and OKAHASHI. And it is just at this moment that you can send us questions directly. With the YouTube channel, you cannot send any questions or comments to the speaker. So please make use of this opportunity, great opportunity, directly asking to Professor Gordon. So now it's time to you, Professor OKAHASHI. Please start your comments.
Good afternoon. In response to Professor Andrew Gordon's talk, let me introduce here some dimensions of UNESCO's official guidelines which may become useful to structure our discussions. UNESCO's World Heritage has a global strategy, a so-called global strategy, which was established to identify underrepresented types of heritage, to fill in the gaps, and to balance the categories of heritage and regional representation on the World Heritage List. The inclusion of industrial heritage was part of the evolution of the expanding notion of heritage on the international level. A global study by ICOMOS revealed that European cultural heritage was overrepresented on the list. Regarding the heritage category, the study pointed out that historic towns, religious monuments, Christianity, Gothic, and elitist architecture were overrepresented. In comparison with all living cultures, especially living traditions. In 1994, the World Heritage Committee launched the Global Strategy for a Representative, Balanced, and Credible World Heritage List. Its aim was to ensure that the list reflects the world's cultural and natural diversity of outstanding universal value. Emerging categories of heritage have since been prioritized and promoted, such as cultural landscapes, roots, industrial heritage, 20th century heritage, deserts, and coastal marine sites. Number of industrial heritage properties then increased on the World Heritage List, especially from European and South American countries. From Japan, we have seen inscriptions already of the Iwami Ginzan silver mine in 2007 and the major industrial sites in 2015. World Heritage Convention and its established system for the implementation of the text is based on what physical attributes we are to conserve for the future generations. It is actually a conservation-based system. Hence, the official narrative of World Heritage Sites is in a way geared towards the objective of conservation. Since the World Heritage List developed initially towards an unbalanced character, the aforementioned global strategy led to regional global strategy action plans, especially in Africa, which focused primarily on capacity building. UNESCO refers to its 5 Cs, which constitute these strategic objectives to promote the implementation of the convention. First, credibility. Then, conservation. Capacity building of experts, individuals, and institutions. Communication. And last but not the least, communities. Increase of industrial heritage sites on the World Heritage List had expanded the global notion of cultural heritage and also contributed to the enhancement of the credibility of the World Heritage List. In other words, to the balance in the notion of heritage. The convention, the World Heritage Convention and its system, I would repeat that it has been a conservation-based system until very recently. So on what basis were the sites of Japan's major industrial revolution nomination? On what basis were they inscribed on the World Heritage List? Here is the brief text. This is the official narrative or official description of the priority, which is composed of a series of 23 components, mainly located in Kyushu and Yamaguchi. I will read out the text, and you might feel or not feel that it is this so-called sanitized story. It bears testimony to the rapid industrialization of the country from the middle of the 19th century to the early 20th century, through the development of the iron and steel industry, shipbuilding, and coal mining. The site illustrates the process by which feudal Japan sought technology transfer from Europe and America in the middle of the 19th century, and how this technology was adopted to the country's needs and social traditions. Talks about technology. The site testifies to what is considered to be the first successful transfer of Western industrialization to a non-Western nation. The initial plan only included components in Kyushu and Yamaguchi, but eventually two tangible components from Iwate and Shizuoka were included in the nomination from Japan to UNESCO. A common value narrative is shared among 11 local authorities in 8 prefectures, along which the 23 selected sites are being valorized. Having introduced some of UNESCO's official guidelines, here, let me come back to what Professor Gordon's lecture inspires us, and to think over these points of discussion. What to conserve is a future-making issue. However, acts of value conservation go together with acts of interpreting such value. What I mean here by interpretation is how to tell, share, and transmit. Telling the pluralistic truth of the past is a work that goes beyond the work of conservation of tangible heritage within a limited value-based boundary. While there could be only one decision among many choices in how to conserve physical attributes, ways of telling the message could be more diverse. Then, how, who, and for whom? An identified history composed of pluralistic truth could be transmitted widely and in the long run. Another discussion here is how the future generations could perceive any heritage value with little tangible proof left on Earth. Let us admit here that works of conservation are indeed important. However, physical conservation works may hinder the living spirit or plural voices if there is no integrated way of interpretation. What is the level of interests and the role of local communities or other types of communities? Could they be custodians of such alternative spaces of pluralistic truth? World Heritage System's main priority is tangible heritage conservation in the present day to link the past to the future. However, the narratives of modern industrial heritage, where concerned generations could still testify, cannot be limited to the actions of tangible heritage conservation, but also to the diverse voices of parties concerned. Coming back to the 5 C's of World Heritage, in order that these global strategic objectives could respond to the increasing demands for a sustainable and inclusive implementation of World Heritage Convention, let's focus here on discussions around the C's of communication and communities, especially that of the communities. The 5th C of communities refers to the important role of the communities in the management, promotion, and development of heritage. Professor Gordon mentioned that heritage is a process and it is fluid. It is a fluid process. Could the involvement of communities be based on a constructive dialogue and enable decision-making opportunities between a wider range of stakeholders? I would like to hear more from you again, Professor Gordon. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor OKAHASHI, for your very interesting comments. And now it's your turn, Professor Gordon, to respond to your comments.
Right. Let me give Professor OKAHASHI a chance to stop the screen share. Great. Well, thank you for these comments. And let me try to answer them and maybe with some somewhat directly and somewhat indirectly. You're absolutely right that the World Heritage Project began with preservation and conservation for the future. And it's only been, I think, along the way and more from the perspective of the communities themselves that seek World Heritage status that another goal has emerged, which is tourism and people coming and spending their money in that town. And so in between conservation on the one hand and community on the other hand is this desire that I see all over the place when I visited these places in Tokyo, but I also see it at least in what I've been able to find more or less indirectly around the world in other World Heritage sites in other countries, which I haven't yet had a chance to visit, but I've read about. So tourism is not, and bringing visitors is not explicitly a purpose of World Heritage Site inscription or an objective, but everybody who seeks it wants that. And so there's a kind of tension between the desire of a local community or a national government, I think, to promote to UNESCO World Heritage inscription in the hope to bring in people to revitalize local economies, and the goals of UNESCO, which have been generally focused on conservation. Although some people I've spoken to who are formerly connected to UNESCO have suggested that it's well understood, and I'm interested, since you have experience at UNESCO, in your thoughts on this, that there's a feedback loop between preservation and visits. Because if lots of people come and visit, that will make people locally more aware, or in the national or prefectural government more aware of the need to spend money to preserve so that people will continue to visit. So it's possible to see the goal of visiting and tourism as not in conflict with, but to some extent supporting the goal of conserving. But beyond that, you raised the question of being able to tell plural stories and how to do this, and the need or the question of whether the way to do this is to bring in players, stakeholders in the various communities. I think when I started this project, I had a slightly naive view that it would be the national governments that wanted to tell the sanitized story and the local community members who would want to tell a fuller story. But that's too simple. At every level, from national to prefectural to local, whether it's municipal or private, I think there's this tension between those who want to tell a story that will make them feel good, and that they feel that the way to bring visitors is tell a happy story, and others who either think that the way to bring visitors is to tell a full story, or also feel that in principle it's important to tell a fuller history. And so that you see tension even within the local community level over what should be told and what should not be told. And you see tension at the national level in the media and in, I think, government and nonprofits that act at a higher level than just local communities. And I found this tension. I visited Sado Island, for instance, which is another location where World Heritage Site inscription is being put forward by the Japanese government. It won't be decided until 2024, I believe, at the earliest. And I find this tension. I visited the coal mining town of Yubari in unease locally or dispute locally over how that story should be told. So that this the trick is that community is an abstraction, and communities are created or composed of, made up of individuals and small groups that themselves have differences. In Miike, mine, for instance, there's a community connected to the former labor union that lost out in the Great Strike of 1960. That's already 60 plus years ago. But still, there's the remnants of that dispute between the first and the second union that divides the town and divides people on what should be told and what shouldn't be told. So I do have some hope that in an open and democratic society, such as Japan or elsewhere, it is possible to bring in different members of the community and different groups, and that this friction isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can lead to a fuller and a richer telling of the stories, and including maybe some divided or antagonistic stories, or at least that's my hope.
Any response, reaction from you?
Yes, well, thank you, Professor Gordon. In your talk, you mentioned about, there was a quote from some exhibition, I think you mentioned in one of your last slides, that what transcends that divide between, transcending the divide between against or not.
Right, that was the Furutaki
yes.
Onsen website, yes.
And this was quite inspiring to me, and also in reaction to what you have just mentioned, that a community is not single, right. And community is composed of various communities. And I also raised that community is not necessarily local.
Right.
And it could be a petition around the world. Communities could be, it's also fluid, but the telling or the message or the image or even the memory of a place or what happened in the history is so diverse.
Right.
So that the interesting point is when it comes to conservation, when the decision would be quite single compared to telling, because it's either to rebuild or to conserve as it is, or to break down, or well, which is not called conservation, but in order to intervene physically, decision has to be single, whereas transmission is not. Right. So here is the balance between what could be told through the physical. Right. So all these different examples you have shown us on the state level, on the corporate level, on municipal, on civil society level, these are all probably true. But we can understand a place thoroughly only when all these stories have been studied. Right. And this has been what I had felt from listening to your story, to your talk.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that the one of the, I didn't mention this in the talk, it's going to be part of my research, I think, is that new technologies offer some prospect for bringing the voices of various technology, of various communities from around the world to a place. You're right that a single decision will be made about how to preserve one place. And the signboards that will be put up by the government managers of that place. But the guides, to some extent, can say what they want to say. And the visitors, to some extent, especially if they bring in their own information on various devices these days, can pull out stories that are told by others. Yes. And so I do think that there's potential for, maybe it'll be cacophony, maybe it'll be tense, maybe it'll be rich, for multiple communities to speak at some of these very specific sites, even if the standard story is sort of contained by the managers, the curators, or at least that's my hope.
Can I interrupt, jump into your discussion?
Of course.
Professor Gordon, you stressed the importance of the interpretation of pluralistic truth, and which is I agree completely with that opinion. And Okahashi-san also told this is a very important point. And my question is to Professor Okahashi, who worked at UNESCO. Does the UNESCO have no intention of admitting pluralistic truth or pluralistic interpretation on one specific historical sites? Because of course there is a very normal or a very typical story to designate that this is a World Heritage, but that is just one viewpoint, and certainly there are some other interpretations.
Yes.
And that is the reason of, how to say, conflict between the countries or communities. So my question is, the UNESCO has the authority, and the UNESCO has also can admit the pluralistic truth.
Right. Thank you for a very important point, Professor Haneda. Actually, in industrial heritage sites, this pluralistic truth, the existence of pluralistic truth, could open up international debates. And I think you have a number of cases in mind. Actually, UNESCO, or here we are talking about the World Heritage Committee, I guess, when we talk about World Heritage Sites, is composed of elected countries, elected governments. So it's not the UNESCO Secretariat, but UNESCO establish a place of discussion. I mean, it opens up a forum, which is also arena of diplomacy, and also political debates as well. And if one country presents a story or a narrative or a message that goes together with tangible heritage sites, if other countries in the arena or in the forum if another country has another truth in mind, interpretation, there is a possibility that such country raise a hand and point it out in the international arena. And within this kind of intergovernmental talk, or I would say the UNESCO meeting, could come out with a result asking the relevant country to improve interpretation. Or
but in the end, they need one story.
Exactly. Well, actually, if another story is told, the former story may be rewritten. So this is a challenge of interpretation. However, if there are in different viewpoints, there is also an idea that different viewpoints could be presented at the same time. Well, probably, if not possible on the state level, it could probably be done on the municipal level or on a web platform, as Professor Gordon just mentioned, that communities don't have to be necessarily locally based. Well, in brief, UNESCO is an intergovernmental body. So there are limits which may be narrowed to the official discourse.
Right, thank you very much. Well, we have a lot of questions, comments, so I will introduce some of them. At first, this is a comment from our common friends in Germany, Professor Victoria Schwarz-Sabo. on the situation in Germany. As you mentioned, Siemens, I was looking up the corporate pages of Siemens, and ThyssenKrupp on the internet. There is no mention about the so-called guest workers on the internet. In the case of Krupp, 1870, more than 60% were Polish. In the popular memory, it was told, even in the 20th century, 1980, that at the Ruhr district, you can pay with Polish money, zloty. So this is just a comment, additional information in case of Germany. You have something to say now?
Yes, I think that, first of all, and I see there are more than one comment asking for comparative reflections. I definitely planned, I started this project in 2019. As you said, I came here and gave a talk, and I had grand plans to travel to places in Europe and in the United States, and perhaps elsewhere in Asia, to look at industrial heritage sites and how it was being treated elsewhere. And these plans, for the time being, came crashing down due to COVID. So I haven't actually been to the industrial heritage sites that exist in the UK, in France, in Germany. I want to plan to go. But looking up online about them, which I have been able to do, of course, I find similar disputes or issues, which is to say, criticism by academics like me who know about the histories of these other places, that the stories are sanitized, that key stuff is left out. And so I imagine if I do go, and it's nice to hear from you, Victoria, as well, it's been a while, if I do go to see some of these spots in Germany, I may well find that, as in Japan, this official story being put forward leaves out a lot. And so that is my guess, is that what you found on the website is not anomalous, but I can't yet say.
Okay. Next one, I will pick up this one from Billy Joel Pedroso. All stories are actually about the past, but are there also specific guidelines from the World Heritage on what should be told and not be told about the industrial heritage sites that can ease the tension about it? This is a question for both of you, maybe.
Right. Why don't I answer it specifically to the issue of wartime labor, and then maybe OKAHASHI-sensei can speak about it more generally. I think, and people connected to UNESCO have told me that, as you said, UNESCO is an international organization, but it's really an intergovernmental organization. And so on the one hand, it's not in the secretariat, and UNESCO is many things. There's a secretariat, I guess that's where you worked for the secretariat. And there's also the member states, they're called the state parties. And the secretariat has limited power to control what states do or say. And so I think this question points to a real dilemma. What's happened with the Meiji sites is, I didn't go into it in detail, but in 2015, the way that the UNESCO World Heritage Conference smoothed out the tension between the South Koreans and the Japanese over forced labor was that the Japanese government made a pledge to tell the full story of wartime forced labor in its ongoing guidelines that it would develop. So that's not a general guideline from UNESCO, but it was a specific guideline about that case. What happened is that, partly delayed by COVID, but finally after 5 years, well, actually not delayed by COVID, because in 2020, after 5 years, finally an information center was opened up in Tokyo, which was supposed to serve as the means by which this promise to tell the fuller story would be fulfilled. It opened up and it was judged by the South Koreans, and also I would agree in this case, as insufficient, that it really was basically mostly a denial of the wartime history rather than a full telling of the history. The Japanese government denies that. A third-party visitation from ICOMOS, the International Committee on Monuments and Sites, has judge that the place is insufficient, and this is still unresolved. So I guess the answer is UNESCO makes efforts in this particular case to set in place guidelines to adjudicate, but there's a limit as to what can be done, and it's still an open story as to what will happen. This coming meeting of the World Heritage Conference of UNESCO will be in Saudi Arabia in, I think, the late summer or early fall. And this issue will be discussed at the time, this issue of the information center and the wartime labor, and we'll see. I don't know what will happen.
Do we have some comments?
Well, if I could add to what Professor Gordon just responded, well, UNESCO doesn't say this is right or wrong, how to tell this. There's no official guideline on what to tell and what not to tell. But when we are referring to World Heritage issues, World Heritage nominations are all value-based. So it all goes around what is the value. And so in order to describe the value, narratives are used so that it could enhance the place to be conserved. So probably that is why the official story narrows down to a narrative which justifies the place to remain. So it is as a consequence, well, in order to evaluate the place, or in order to justify why the place has to remain to the future generations, narratives are created. So it's not from the UNESCO side how to interpret, but it is from the state side the interpretation is presented. If this responds to the question.
Thank you very much. And just since the time is limited, so just one more question, or maybe question, simple but important question. Thanks a lot for the introduction of the 2 sites and 5C rules. May I ask if there's no or little such preservation awareness among the community? How can we form or strengthen one? Because here in my city, we are facing this problem within young generations. It's a very general question.
Yes, I'm not sure if this question is coming from Japan or elsewhere, but I wasn't trying to say that there's little or no preservation awareness among the community. And maybe in this questioner's community, that's what they feel, and so that would be the case, and I'm not going to disagree in your specific case, but I find a lot of interest in preservation and marking, and that's one of the things I was trying to do today. One of the particular entities in Japan at the local level that plays such a key role here is the Kyoiku-in-kai, which has the mission, well, several missions, I'm sorry, Board of Education, Kyoiku-in-kai. One of its missions is to mark the history of that town or city. And so there were so many boards put up in Ashio by the Kyoiku, and I saw that in, for instance, in Miike, where on the one hand, the official story of the Miike mine is very sanitized, the city, the Board of Education signage around the city is pretty rich. And so now marking through signage isn't the same as preservation. And just because there's a sign doesn't mean there's a budget for preservation. So this is tricky. But I do think there's awareness of this issue, and you know, perhaps this awareness will lead or does lead to efforts to preserve. There's financial constraints here too, and a lot of communities all around Japan are facing declining populations, so there's less tax revenues. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, in response to this question, you just now mentioned the Board of Education.
Right.
Actually, I was going to respond the linkage between heritage issues and education, which is also which in the sense of school education, formal education, and also informal education. Well, public awareness can be drawn up through curiosity, if not interests. Tourism is the interest of the public, which triggers the public awareness. But curiosity is something so important in childhood and in school education, how to start raising questions. And actually, by being at the place is probably the most important thing for the local communities, because many of us, regardless of where we live, tend to not know very well our local neighborhood. And so if there could be educational programs with schools or beyond of very young generations, including, I mean, children, who could also be teachers of their parents, this is a possible solution to be able to enrich and expand the future interpreters.
That is one of the UNESCO's very important missions, promote education, I believe.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Right. The E in UNESCO is for education, right?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you very much for both. The time is now up. Professor Gordon will leave Japan at the end of this month. So this time we'll have no time to listen to him once again. But I'm sure that he will come back. If he promised me to come back here next year as well. So we'll have another talk by Professor Gordon probably next year or in 2 years, and listen to the development of his research soon. So today, that's all. And bye for now, and see you again soon on the screen.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.